Standing in your field at the end of the season, have you ever wondered why the harvest wasn't as great as expected, despite devoting such a large space to potatoes? Have you ever felt that even though you planted a long furrow full of potatoes, the yield didn't seem to match the effort you put in? Even though you grow them properly every year, have you ever been left with a sense of insufficiency after each harvest? Have you ever wondered if it wasn't a lack of effort, but the cultivation method itself? Have you ever marveled at how a tiny corner of the garden could be more efficient than a long furrow? What if the way you have believed in until now was not necessarily wrong, but simply not the best? I held those exact feelings for many years. Every time spring arrived, I prepared seed potatoes, made furrows, and placed them into the soil one by one. When the sprouts emerged, I mounded the soil, and when the leaves grew, I checked on them again. I continued doing what everyone else around me did, as if it were the natural way. It's not that the harvest was ever a complete failure. There were years when the weather was good, and things lined up, resulting in a decent yield. For our family dining table, it was never a pitiable amount. Yet somewhere in my heart, a small snag always remained. I felt that this place could truly work harder for us. I felt that this effort should in reality return to us in a slightly different form. At the end of one particular year, I had the chance to compare two methods of growing potatoes. One was the traditional long furrow. They were lined up beautifully, and even a quick glance showed how much care had been put into them. They used a fair amount of soil area, and visually it felt like a proper, well-kept vegetable garden. The other was a small vertical structure placed in a corner of the garden. To be honest, when I first saw it, it didn't feel as persuasive as the long furrow. It was too small, too quiet, and didn't look like the main actor capable of supporting a harvest. However, as I watched it for a while, that very smallness began to feel like a strong anomaly. Why can't I stop thinking about such a tiny place? Why do I feel like the answer is hidden there rather than in the wide furrows? That is how I began to think. My neighbor was a very serious gardener. He wasn't someone who worked sloppily. He managed watering and soil properly in his own way. Therefore, my pondering wasn't about the simple story of results didn't come because someone slacked off. What appeared to be the problem was a limit that is difficult to notice precisely because a person is doing things properly. The traditional method is not wrong. However, if asked whether it is truly the smartest way to use land in our current lives, where garden space is limited, perhaps there is room to reconsider. That feeling grew stronger, bit by bit. That was when my attention turned to the cultivation methods cherished by the Amish. My attraction to it wasn't because of its rarity or any mystical atmosphere. What struck my heart the most was their stance of not wasting land. To support a family's dining table, every single crop must fulfill its role properly. In such a lifestyle, methods that use a lot of area but yield little result would eventually fade away. What remains over generations is not visual flashiness, but only the contrivances that are actually helpful. That fact felt very heavy to me. It was then that I finally began to change my perspective. Perhaps what was lacking wasn't motivation or perseverance. Perhaps the smallness of the garden itself wasn't the problem. Maybe the real problem was that I had only been looking at potatoes with an overly conventional view. Perhaps I was only thinking about providing a large area and never considered how hard a single plant could work. Maybe I only imagined stretching things out horizontally and never had the idea of utilizing height. From then on, the way I saw potato cultivation changed. I began to see them not just as a crop to be buried in the soil and waited upon, but as a subject to consider how can I draw out their inherent power more effectively. Perhaps what needs to change is not the number of furrows. Perhaps what needs to change is how I understand the stems growing right before my eyes. If what truly needs to change is not the width of the furrow, but the use of the stems, then it may be necessary to rethink the very way we grow potatoes. When I began rethinking how to grow potatoes, the first thing to change wasn't the shape of the tower. It wasn't the materials I used. The very first thing to change was my view of the potato as a plant. Until then, I had thought very simply. Put seed potatoes in the soil, sprouts emerge, leaves grow, and at the end of the season you harvest potatoes from around the base. If you grow them well, you get a little more. If the weather is on your side, it gets a little better. I had grown them with that level of understanding for a long time. That way of thinking wasn't completely wrong, but a vital piece was missing. Potatoes are plants that react not only to sunlight, water, and soil conditions, but also very honestly to how their stems are buried in the soil. In fact, I believe this is the point that has been passed over without clear explanation in many home vegetable gardens for a long time. It is often said that potatoes require earthing up or mounding. However, there are not many opportunities to think deeply about what that mounding is for. We tend to settle for the understanding that it's just to prevent them from falling over, to keep things looking tidy, or to protect the base. Of course, it has those meanings, but that is not all. Mounding is involved in the very possibility of the potato plant creating new tubers. By burying part of the stem in soil or straw at the right timing, a trigger for new development is born beneath, which expands the possibility of those parts becoming potatoes later on. When you are conscious of this mechanism, you begin to see why the traditional method of long furrows, which I thought was normal, rarely produces a significant difference in results. You plant in a furrow, sprouts come up, they grow a little, and you mound the soil once. A diligent person might mound it one more time. Most people do that much, but usually they stop there. Then they just wait for them to grow naturally until the end of the season. You can harvest this way. However, it's as if the room for the plant to work further is closed off midway. In other words, the length of the stem that the potato can actually use ends up being much shorter than it could be. What remained with me then was a single thought, short, yet strangely unforgettable. Perhaps what potatoes need is not wide land, but the length of the stem that can produce tubers. When I first thought this, it felt almost too simple. However, the more I observed, the more I understood the weight of this idea. Merely lengthening a furrow might just be repeating the same method over a larger area. But if you bury the stems to make use of them anew every time they grow, the very way a single plant works might change. Here, the meaning of growing vertically finally comes into view. It is not significant, because the appearance is rare. Stuffing soil or straw into a high frame is not special in itself. What is important is for humans to lend a hand in accordance with the flow of the plant's growth. When the stem grows, you gently bury most of it again. However, you don't hide everything. You leave the top leaves so they can receive light. Then it grows again, so you layer further. This repetition is the major difference from the method of mounding soil only once or twice in a furrow. It's not about burying it deep all at once. It's about utilizing it in stages as it grows. However, I must honestly say one important thing here. It's not that the higher you layer, the more they will increase infinitely. Potatoes are, after all, plants. They need sufficient sunlight, and moisture must not fluctuate extremely. The soil inside must not be too hard, and conversely, if it is too flimsy, the growth will not be stable. And above all, it is crucial that the variety is suited for this method. If the conditions aren't met, a tower might only look novel while the results don't change much. I believe it is more important to convey this clearly. Methods that borrow the power of nature are more reliable when spoken of through the conditions that truly make them work rather than as magic. Looking back, the reason many people struggle to improve their results isn't because they are slacking. I think they have simply been taught that mounding is a minor task in the overall process. However, in this method, that seemingly minor task is at the very center. Stems buried at the appropriate time create new possibilities. Conversely, stems left exposed above ground for too long miss that opportunity. Thinking this way, the potato tower appears not as a rare cultivation tool, but as a way of thinking to more correctly use the functions that potatoes inherently possess. And from here, another important crossroads appears. Not every variety will respond in the same way. Even if you bury them carefully and pay attention to water if the variety doesn't fit, the difference might not be as great as expected. Therefore, if you truly want to make the most of this method, the next thing to consider is not how splendidly to build the tower, but which variety to choose at the beginning. Once you grasp the mechanism of how potatoes grow, the next concern is how to actually bring that concept to life. However, the point where many people stumble is at the very first entrance before building the frame or layering the soil and straw. I have seen many people who built a splendid potato tower, prepared the soil with care, and watered diligently, yet were left disappointed by a lack of significant results at harvest time. In those moments, it's tempting to think the structure was flawed or the water management was sloppy. While that can be true, there is a much more fundamental choice made even earlier, the selection of the variety. This is a part that is surprisingly often overlooked. Since a potato is a potato, many assume it doesn't matter which one you use. I used to think the same, that as long as the cultivation method was sound, any variety would respond reasonably well. However, in the vertical method, that logic doesn't always hold. Some varieties respond vigorously to the repeated burying of their stems, while others, despite appearing healthy above ground, fail to produce the expected increase in yield. In other words, you can work hard to add layer after layer, but the plant itself might not utilize the advantages of that method. When that happens, the effort feels wasted, as the results don't differ much from a standard furrow. Therefore, I have come to see variety selection not just as a preparation task, but as the primary crossroads. If this matches every subsequent task, gains meaning. If it's mismatched, no matter how carefully you nurture it, the result will likely be unconvincing. Experienced growers don't choose a variety just because it's convenient or easy to find. They look at the growth habits and choose one suited for vertical cultivation. In the world of potatoes, some mature quickly and compactly, while others grow slowly and steadily. For a method that involves layering vertically, it is vital to choose a type that reacts clearly to the burying of its stems. Of course, the point here isn't to memorize many difficult names. What matters is not assuming everything is the same. That shift in perspective alone significantly changes the success rate. In this method, varieties known for long growing seasons, or those that naturally produce tubers along the stem, are often preferred. This is why russet types, or certain late-maturing varieties, are frequently discussed. However, more than memorizing names, what's needed is an attitude of searching for a variety that fits your specific purpose. That attitude determines whether the contents of the tower will truly deliver. Once the variety is decided, the next step is preparing the seed potatoes. This is another part that seems small, but is actually significant. Some plant them whole, while others cut large ones into random pieces. Both can affect the uniformity of growth depending on the situation. If left too large, too many sprouts may emerge, leading to crowding. If cut too small, the initial vigor of each piece may be weak. I feel most secure when each cut piece has several healthy eyes, or sprout points. This ensures the starting power is consistent. Furthermore, after cutting it, is important not to put them into a damp environment immediately. Taking the time to let the cut surfaces dry and callus over makes the subsequent handling much more stable. It's a small wait, but such minor steps pay off later. Looking at this stage, I feel I can see whether the year's cultivation will begin with care. Planting in a rush may get the work done faster, but an overly hurried start often leads to a rushed and anxious approach to management later on. One more thing I strongly feel is the peace of mind that comes from the source of the seed potatoes. I won't say that using supermarket potatoes for eating never works. However, when the reaction of the variety and the uniformity of the start are as crucial as they are in this method, my mind is more at ease using certified seed potatoes. Potato cultivation isn't over in a few weeks. It's a long-term commitment. Introducing something uncertain at the start leaves a lingering anxiety. Conversely, a solid start allows you to tend to the plant without hesitation. At this point, the foundation is finally set. You have the concept of vertical, growing a suited variety, and seed potatoes prepared with composure. Only when these elements are aligned does building the tower truly gain meaning. No matter how magnificent the exterior, using an unsuited variety will blunt the results. On the contrary, if the inconspicuous preparations are solid, every subsequent layer will truly come to life. This stage, though modest, must not be skipped. It is only when this is in order that the mechanism of vertical potato growing begins to take real tangible shape. When the variety is right and the preparation of seed potatoes is calmly finished, it's finally time to turn the concept into a physical form. This is when the potato tower begins to take its actual shape in the garden. However, the first thing I want to convey is that looking impressive and working effectively are not the same thing. Beginners often feel they must finish it beautifully, but what the potato truly needs isn't aesthetic perfection. What matters is whether there is an environment where the stems can be buried naturally as they grow. In other words, the tower itself isn't special. What matters is whether it serves as a tool to create that specific environment. When I think of a good tower, I always keep 3 simple conditions in mind. First, it must maintain its shape until the end of the season. If it collapses or bulges midway, the flow of layering is disrupted. Second, it must not allow water to pool excessively inside. Potatoes need moisture, but they dislike a stifling, waterlogged state. Third, it must not be too narrow. If it's too cramped, the layers inside will press against each other, making the stem growth and soil settling unnatural. If these 3 are met, you can feel quite secure. You don't need to feel pressured to perfectly mimic a shape you saw somewhere else. What happens inside is far more important than how the outside looks. Perhaps the easiest way to start in a home garden is by rolling wire mesh into a cylindrical shape. If you cut it to length, bend it, and secure the ends firmly, it becomes a perfectly functional frame. The benefit of this shape is that air passes through easily, and the internal conditions don't become stagnant. Even if too much water enters, it doesn't stay trapped, and the frame is easy to remove at harvest time. I like this simplicity. However, it doesn't have to be wire mesh. A large container with drainage holes or a simple wooden frame will do. You can even repurpose materials like pallets. The point is whether the potato can grow without strain within that frame throughout the season. The plant doesn't judge the neatness of the exterior. It simply reacts to the conditions inside. Once the frame is made, the next thing to consider is the location. Sometimes potatoes appear to grow even in semi-shaded spots. However, if you're aiming for a solid harvest, it's safer to place them in a sunny location. Only when the foliage grows vigorously above ground can the activity in the lower layers remain stable. Choosing a spot that receives light throughout the day, rather than tucking it into the shade just for convenience, makes a difference later on. Once the location is decided, placing a light material like straw against the inner walls helps prevent the initial soil from spilling out. This step is inconspicuous, but helps the layers settle and keeps the internal materials together. Next comes the soil. You could say this is what determines the air inside the tower. If you use soil that is too heavy and prone to compaction, water won't drain, and the stems and roots won't be able to grow comfortably. Conversely, if it's too light and lacks nutrients or organic matter, the initial vigor will likely be weak. What's needed is a medium sensation, neither too hard nor too flimsy. It should feel fluffy in your hand, yet not so dry that it falls apart. When it holds water, it shouldn't clump into a soggy mass, but allow moisture to spread softly throughout. When you can create this state, the inside of the tower becomes very stable. I find that compost mixed with light organic matter like straw is well suited for this purpose. The first layer is the quiet beginning that sets the flow for the year. Place the soil at a suitable thickness at the bottom and arrange the prepared seed potatoes on top. It's important not to cram them too tightly, leaving room for each to head upwards. Cover them gently with more soil so the seed potatoes can start moving with composure. At this point, there's no major change visible on the outside, but in gardening, these quiet moments are vital. Beneath the soil, the first movement of a new season has begun. And after that quiet start, sprouts will eventually appear heading upward. From that point on, it's not just about watching. The real fun begins as you add layers in accordance with the growing stems. The true work of a potato tower doesn't end when the frame is built. It only truly begins once the sprouts emerge. When the first sprouts begin to peek through the surface of the tower, this method finally starts to move in its true sense. Up to that point, it was a time of preparation, choosing the variety, prepping the seed potatoes, building the frame, and adding the soil. Each is an indispensable and important stage. However, from here on, the results are not determined by the carefulness of preparation alone. What significantly influences the actual harvest is how well-timed you can lend a hand to the growing potatoes. In other words, from this part forward, you are tested on how you interact with the flow of the seasons. This is precisely where the vertical method looks markedly different from ordinary furrow cultivation. It is not about planting once and being done, but responding as the stems grow and layering accordingly. By involving yourself repeatedly in accordance with the growth, the meaning of this method gradually takes shape. I feel this time of tending is like a quiet dialogue with the plant. Potatoes do not have words, but every time the stems grow a little, they send a signal. Sometimes, it looks as if they are saying, "You can add another layer now." If you miss that signal and leave them for too long, the stems that have finally grown will be difficult to utilize as the strength of this method. Conversely, if you are too early or too late, the flow tends to get disrupted. That is why it is important not to proceed on momentum alone, but to observe closely and add the next layer at just the right point. I believe this is closer to a task of gradually refining the shape in accordance with the waves of growth rather than a tedious chore. Once the stems have grown to a certain extent, you add new soil or straw. However, you must not bury them entirely up to the leaves. The green parts at the top must be properly left exposed. This is because the leaves receive light and create the energy that supports everything that follows. If your mind is only focused on stacking things high, it is easy to disrupt this vital balance. Conversely, if you leave too much of the green part exposed, the advantage of this method utilizing the stems is diminished. Ultimately, what is needed here is the ability to see the proper measure. Not making drastic changes, but proceeding a little at a time every time, yet without hesitation. That accumulation eventually results in a major difference, and as you enter this stage, water management becomes increasingly important. A tower has more surfaces exposed to the outside air than an ordinary furrow, and the moisture levels inside are quite different. While good ventilation is an advantage, it also means it dries out faster. Even if the leaves on the surface still look healthy, the inside might already be starting to dry out gradually. If this state continues, even if the plant itself stays alive, the quality of the harvested potatoes will change. The way they fatten up won't be stable, and differences in uniformity will likely appear. This is why I have stopped leaving the watering of the tower to intuition. Rather than deciding based on a vague memory that it's about time, it is important to check the moisture levels inside and add water so that it reaches deep down. What potatoes dislike is not just drying out. A state of great fluctuation where water suddenly increases after being too dry is also undesirable. What is necessary is stability rather than just giving plenty. Rather than forgetting today and giving a lot together tomorrow, it is much more reassuring to maintain a constant flow, even if it is a little at a time. This simple thing actually significantly dictates the success of the tower. When things don't go well, people inevitably want to search for the cause in the variety materials or structure. However, in reality, there are many cases where the waves of moisture being too large during the season quietly lower the harvest yield. The same kind of calm thinking is required for fertilizer. When the foliage is lush, you naturally want to feel relieved, and conversely, when vigor seems lacking, you might want to give more. However, in the case of potatoes, even if the upper part is healthy, it is meaningless if the bottom does not correspond to it. Particularly if it is too biased toward nitrogen, They might look vigorous, but it can lead to a lack of satisfaction at harvest. If the soil initially put in is solid, that becomes the foundation. Even if adding more, it is often enough to support it modestly while observing the situation. A garden does not become stronger just by adding anything. It works most calmly when it is supported just the right amount. Observing people trying this method for the first time, there are several similar ways they stumble. First is thinking that the tower will somehow take care of things, even if the variety is not suited. Second is missing the rhythm by trying to add soil all at once after the stems have grown considerably. Third is the inside becoming stifled because the soil is too heavy or too compacted. Fourth is making watering a matter of memory rather than a habit. Fifth is seeking very large numbers from the first year. I believe that if you can grasp a tangible sense of success on a small area in the first year, that alone is a sufficiently large step forward. What matters is not flashy results, but whether you can feel the soundness of this method in your own garden. As each aspect of management settles, small changes will also appear in the state of the potatoes. The stems and leaves pass the period of mere growth and head toward the next stage. Eventually, when flowers begin to appear, you know that the plant has started focusing its energy on a slightly different task than before. From that point on, what is important is not to continue layering higher and higher forever. Now it becomes important to judge when to stop so the plant can concentrate its energy on the potatoes growing inside. Once you can make that judgment, tower cultivation transforms from a merely interesting method into a calm way of growing that supports the plant along the flow of the seasons. When the flowers bloom and then quietly fade away, the potato tower begins to show yet another expression. Up to that point, it was a time of observing the stems every time they grew and considering whether to add the next layer. However, what becomes important from here on is not stacking things up as before, but rather easing your hand. It feels as though growing plants well means continuing to add something, but in reality, stopping at just the right point is equally important. At this stage, the potato is no longer seeking to only stretch upwards. It begins to need stable time to concentrate its energy on what has started growing inside. Every time I see this change, I feel that the fascination of gardening lies not only in taking care of things, but also in not overtending. The arrival of flowers is one of the visible signals. Around that time, the plant shifts its work from rapidly adding new sections toward settling the flow it has created and growing the potatoes inside. Eventually, the color of the stems and leaves also changes little by little. What was once a vigorous green begins to take on a soft yellow, gradually bringing to mind the end of the season in the light. To someone growing them for the first time, this change might look a little concerning. You might worry that they have weakened and want to check the inside quickly. However, the potato is a plant that gives firm meaning to its final moments. During those few weeks, the potatoes inside fill out further, their skins gradually settle, and they approach a form that is easy to store. That is exactly why it is important not to rush here. When the day of harvest finally arrives, the enjoyment unique to this method is best understood. If it is a tower made of wire mesh, you can unfasten the secured parts and open it slowly, and the things you have piled up inside will softly crumble down. I am moved a little every year by the sight of that moment. Unlike the feeling of searching one by one while turning over a lot of soil, as when digging up potatoes grown in a furrow here, the season itself appears before your eyes as layers. In the time spent picking up potatoes of various sizes, as they gradually appear from between the straw and soil, there is a gentle joy like treasure hunting. It is easy for small children to help, and the light physical burden for adults might be an unexpected benefit of this method. I believe this ease of harvest is also one of the charms of the potato tower. There is less worry about damaging the potatoes by digging too deeply, and it is easy to see what kind of growth each layer produced. However, what I don't want to forget here is how to receive the results. To be honest, dramatic numbers do not come out in the same way every year. There is the weather, and there is the compatibility of the variety. The impression also changes depending on water management, sunlight, and the quality of the soil. That is why I believe it is better not to make large numbers the only objective when talking about this method. What is truly important for the first year is whether you can feel that the small area worked much better than expected. If that feeling is obtained, it is a sufficiently valuable harvest. I do not wish to deny traditional furrow cultivation. If you have wide land and can produce calmly with familiar procedures, that has its own merits. However, many modern home vegetable gardens by no means have infinite space. It is necessary to consider how much area to use for which crop within a limited location. In such a garden, the idea of utilizing potatoes vertically holds great meaning. It is not about discarding old ways, but about thinking how to use the power a single plant possesses more efficiently. Ultimately, I believe the charm of this method lies not in the special tools themselves, but in being able to rethink the possibilities of familiar plants from a slightly different angle. And after talking about the tower this far, another, even gentler method I want to introduce is starting with straw alone. I like bringing this up last. This is because for someone whose interest has been piqued after hearing this far, but who feels building a frame right away is a bit heavy, it becomes a very accessible option. The method is much lighter. Place seed potatoes on the ground and cover them with plenty of straw. Then, as the sprouts grow, layer more straw on top. The core of what you are doing is the same as tower cultivation. The concept of utilizing the growing stems does not change. This method is simply a form that allows you to try that more casually. Of course, the straw-only method does not necessarily yield the same results as a tower every time. Depending on the conditions, you might feel that the tower makes it easier to keep the layers stable and manage the whole process. Even so, this straw method has its own charm. Preparation is minimal, the psychological burden is small, and it is very suited to that first step of just trying it out. Gardening can sometimes be difficult to start if you brace yourself too much. However, just by understanding one mechanism of nature and trying it out on a small scale, the way you see the garden can change significantly. What this story about potatoes taught me was more than just the harvest yield. It was becoming able to have better questions even when facing the same soil. Thinking not about how to expand, but how to utilize. Once that perspective is ingrained, the garden becomes a slightly deeper and more interesting place than before. If you want to try one new thing in the next season, even starting from just a tiny corner is enough. That small change might be the beginning of a season different from any before.